I was just completely grabbed by the subject matter and the investigation that she'd done, and got in touch, and thought she would be a fantastic speaker. So welcome, Maeve, and thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and as I understand, this is a really expert group of people, so I hope what I have to say is interesting and not stuff you all already know. But I wanted to talk you all through a project that I've worked on. So I'm a journalist at a place called the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And we work on long-term investigative projects, and then we partner with different media outlets to get those stories out. And I work particularly with a group that connects up with local journalists all around the country. So we have this network of more than 1,000 people around the UK. And so I've written a fair bit in the past about vulnerable people, be it asylum-seeking people, be it domestic violence survivors and refuge occupants. And that was very much my area of interest. And then I started on this project, Dying Homeless, which, if we flip to the next slide, I'll explain a bit more. Do I have control of the slides? No, I don't think I do. No, good. So it really began with the fact that a series of stories kept seeming to kind of pop up on my radar. I kept reading these one-off, often local news reports about somebody who had died while often sleeping rough, often in really tragic circumstances. And there was this one particular case in January there, or sorry, that was February, where somebody died in London, just metres away from the Houses of Parliament. There was another case in Lowestoft in Suffolk where a man who had lived in his house and been evicted died in his back garden a day or so after Christmas. And every time the news articles seemed to have a kind of similar structure. It was kind of horrifying details of this person's death, some raised voices in outrage, and then not much more. There was no real grappling of how this was happening or why it was happening or how often it was happening. And I was living and working in London at the time, and I could see really clearly in front of me every day there seemed to be an increase in people experiencing homelessness and sleeping rough. You know, my walk from work, there would be more and more tents, kind of people sitting out, that kind of thing. Every time it felt like every week. So I had this, what I thought was a simple question, which was, if we know more people are experiencing homelessness, are more people dying while experiencing homelessness than previously? And I set out to try and answer that simple question. I spoke to everyone I could think of, and everybody pointed me to someone else. So the police said, we don't collect it, but maybe try the hospitals, they might. The hospital said, no, we very often, you know, we won't ask people's fixed abode, you know, the address details, and we don't collect that in any standardized way. So we don't have that, but maybe the coroners would. So I went to the coroners and they said, no, there's no checkbox, so we don't have it. Ask the council. The council said, we don't, maybe central government. The central government said, we don't try the police. And I went round and round and round until I came to the shocking realization that nobody held that data. Now, often as an investigative journalist, that might be where the story ends. You know, my hypothesis can't be delved into anymore because there is no information. But when I went to my editors and I told them that, we were all so horrified and so shocked that there wasn't any accounting of this, any kind of registering or logging of people's deaths, that we decided we would set out and try and do it ourselves. Have the next slide, please. So to do that, we had to come up with a kind of methodology of how we would do it. The first, as you will all be far too aware, that, you know, homelessness is an incredibly complex subject, and we had to come up with a definition. It became very clear very early on from my talks with lots of experts that it's a very can be a very transitory kind of state of affairs existence. You might be sleeping rough for a period of time, then sofa surfing for a few weeks, then in a hostel for a few weeks, then back on the streets for a night, etc., etc. So we realized just counting deaths that took place of rough sleepers wasn't going to be a true figure. You know, people might have been in hospital for weeks or months, despite the fact they had no home. So we came up with a definition that we based from what Crisis, the national charity, uses in their reports, which includes people sleeping rough, people in emergency accommodation, and sofa surfers. So we knew then that we had a kind of parameter for what we were looking at. And we decided we were going to use this network that we have of 1,000 eyes and ears on the ground, pairs of eyes and ears on the ground across the country. And we're going to try and crowdsource as much as we could. So we asked people, wherever you hear of somebody who's died that you think was experiencing homelessness, please fill in this simple Google form with as many details as you can. Then I would go and cross-check each of those. So if it came from a journalist, we trusted that they had done the reporting. If it came from an official kind of homelessness organisation, we would use it. And if it came from a member of the public, we would have to go and check with localised groups to try and get some corroboration on the details. And we wanted to really make sure that we were reporting or collecting these names sensitively. So if people said, look, I'll give you a list of names in my area, but I don't feel comfortable you publishing those names, then we could anonymise them and make sure that there was a record, a kind of public-facing record and a private record. Then alongside that, I did just a very arduous, long internet search, trying to collect all of those local reports that I had spotted and log them as well, because there was a lot of information out there. It was just kind of disparate and, you know, not collected in any which way. So I set up a very sad Google News alerts as well, so that every time the words kind of deaf and rough sleeper or deaf and homelessness or deaf and homeless came up, I would be alerted as well. And then even though all of those local authorities said we don't hold the information, I put in freedom of information requests to every local authority across the UK. And actually we found that in some areas, particularly Scotland and Northern Ireland, there was some data held. So we were able to combine that into our information. And then in London, the chain database, which is how they kind of coordinate, you know, services across all of the boroughs in London, they had some information in there kind of hidden away. They had reasons why people were no longer using services. And one of the kind of subpoints in that was that the person had passed away. So it was this jigsawing together of data to try and come to a figure. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we launched this back in, oh, that says 2017, sorry, it's actually April 2018 we launched it. I'd worked backwards and collected data through the winter of 2017-18. And at that point, our data showed that every week, 2 people had died while sleeping rough and homeless. And we collated those information. We realised quite early on that it wasn't enough to come up with a figure. This wasn't about cold hard data. This was about people's lives. So we wanted to find a way to memorialise and tell a little bit of some of those stories. So as well as our kind of top line data figure, we created a page on our website that held, where we could, little commemorative snippets about the people in our database, either details of their death, if we thought, you know, that's relevant to the public understanding of how these things happen, or things of their life and, you know, their hopes, their dreams, messages from their loved ones. And that became a really powerful way to show the human cost of this. It's very easy to say X or Y figure, but scrolling, just the sheer the time it takes to scroll through that list and read those stories, I think really drove the gravity of the situation home in a way that a newspaper article couldn't do. So we started that, and then with that launch, we told people, you know, tell us where you hear these things, tell us more, because we know this isn't the full picture. We want to keep going on this. And then can we get to the next slide, please? And so by that October, we had, by the end of our project, the end of the year, we had pulled together all of these figures and findings, and we had counted around 800 people in the 18-month period that we looked at that we believe had died while experiencing homelessness. And we knew that that was a vast underestimate, sadly, but it was the first figure of its kind that showed us, you know, just how large an issue this is and how shocking it is. And we were able to drill into our data and see, you know, that the vast majority were men. I think that reflects often the kind of situation that we see, particularly amongst rough sleepers, in terms of it skews more heavily male. We weren't definitively able to say where everybody was when they died, but we were able to see that, you know, 84 of them, of the people in our database, had died while they were physically on the streets. 60 had been in temporary accommodation. Only 20 had been in hospital. And this is where we knew our data had a blind spot, which was those people that died in hospital, you know, on occasion after long stays, just wouldn't come on the radar of local reporters. They might not, you know, they wouldn't be on the radar necessarily of the homelessness services they were accessing. Who were the people telling us this? So there were people there passing away that didn't make it into our data set. And that the average age was shockingly low, 48 years old for men, 54 years old for women. We saw a range of causes, but violence and suicide were higher, I guess, than I, as a lay member of the public, would have expected. Drug and alcohol issues seemed to come up quite frequently as well. And then, you know, through learning a bit more of the stories of some people, we heard about the complex myriad issues that lay behind some of these deaths and lay behind the experiences people were having. Things like being no recourse to public funds and having kind of immigration status that shuts you out from certain services, the prevalence of family breakdown, the prevalence of mental health issues, and the shockingly high prevalence of adverse childhood experience being a kind of common factor in a lot of the stories we heard. And then like I say, tried to go beyond the figures and get to know a bit about some of the people who had passed away. So there's Nikolai there standing up with his hands in his pockets. He was selling the Big Issue in Islington. He was classified as no recourse to public funds. Despite the fact he was, you know, earning money through the Big Issue, that wasn't considered by the council as, you know, as a wage, so he couldn't access certain facilities. He was in hospital getting treatment for, I believe it was cirrhosis of the liver, brought on likely by alcohol intake, and then was discharged from hospital, terminally ill, because the hospital could no longer do anything for him, was moved to a hostel near Euston Station and died in a hostel. And that was really shocking to me, that hostel workers were expected to nurse this man to his death. Not something that's in their job description, but there just wasn't a place for Nikolai to go. The hospital needed a bed, the hostel was there. That was really shocking to me. The woman in the middle there is Jane Simpson. I got to know Jane's mum really well, and that broke down a lot of stigma to me, kind of false assumptions to me, that Jane had this really loving family and a mum who was desperately trying to help her and had been for years. And I had naively assumed that Jane was sleeping rough, people sleeping rough were kind of cast aside from society, from their families, from their friends, had no connections, you know, were adrift in life. Actually, Jane did have support networks and loved ones. I went to her funeral and I went to the inquest around her death. And was really heartened at her funeral that it was just full of people. Again, my naivety and my kind of biases, I guess, thought maybe there'd be a handful of people there, but it was packed out. People were telling beautiful stories about, you know, the life that she had, the joy that she brought to people. And it was just really tragic to hear the ways that she had managed to slip through the cracks in the safety net. She had gone to the doctor finally, to her GP finally, for help, asking for mental health support. They had sent her kind of file to a specialist service who had tried to reach out to her. She hadn't turned up to an appointment. They were meant to make a second appointment, and an administrative error meant that they didn't. And by the time they came to reach out to her for that second appointment, she had died. So that was really a tragic story. And then Hamid here at the end, an Iranian refugee who was living in a car that had been donated to him by people in Harlow, where he lived. Again, kind of mental health issues. Came in the one, there was a Beast for the East, was brought into a hotel as kind of temporary accommodation and passed away there. So being able to tell some of their stories, and I go on and do that in much greater detail in the book, was a real honour to be able to explain a little bit about who these people are. They're not faceless numbers. It's very easy to walk past people and not understand how they got to the places that they are, and and equally importantly, to understand where it was in the system that things fell apart for them. What lessons can we learn so that Hamid and Jane and Nikolai, those deaths aren't repeated again? Was it about services talking to each other? Was it that there was cuts to a service that used to be there that wasn't? Was there some service that hadn't even been dreamt up yet that actually could have helped them? That was the kind of next step that I wanted to look at. Next slide, please. And another major takeaway from the investigation was looking at if and when there are reviews into the deaths. So, halfway through, I guess, this investigation, I started to think, I can't be the only one that wants to learn these lessons. There must be other people trying to work this out. And it became apparent that there was this mechanism through which to do this, the Safeguarding Adult Review, which I think it's Homeless Link suggests that every time somebody who's sleeping rough passes away, they suggest there should be a Safeguarding Adult Review. Oh, here it is, I put it on the slide. And so I asked all of the local authorities who, at that point, I knew that there had been a death in their area. So that was 83 different deaths at that point. I asked each of them, have you had a review into this death? And not a single one had. And then we actually, my data colleague managed to scrape for the term online for Safeguarding Adult Reviews, all of the ones that we could see, and look in them for anything mention of homelessness or rough sleeping. And we could only find 8 reviews that had been published anywhere by Safeguarding Adult Review boards since 2010. So it just seemed like they just weren't happening. Partly because there's no statutory duty to do that, where there is for certain deaths. Homelessness falls just outside of that, although there is an argument that some of the wording around the statutory duty around neglect or failure of authorities to protect people could be applied to people sleeping rough who died. But it wasn't explicit enough that local authorities felt like they had to. And Safeguarding Adult Reviews are expensive. People told me quite blatantly, these cost a lot of money, and we can't be doing them for everyone. But a real great upshot of the investigation was there does seem to have been this uptick in thematic reviews being held by councils across the country, particularly in areas where there might have been 1 or 2 or 3 deaths that have happened in a row in a short space of time. There's this kind of acceptance now that there needs to be a look into what services were available and how the people were being served or weren't. So that was a really great positive outcome, although I would still argue that we could go further, potentially changing the wording to make statutory duty apply for all rough sleeper deaths, or at least kind of lobbying for the recognition that it should be something that's taken into account if there is any question as to whether services could have done a better job. Next slide, please. And then the really big outcome of the project was that, we had started this because no one was collecting the data. And by the time we published our final figures, someone was collecting the data. The Office for National Statistics started putting out figures on rough sleeper deaths, homeless deaths, which they had got in touch earlier in the year, and we had opened up our database to them so that they could develop their methodology. They have access to death records, death certificates, which we don't as journalists. So they were able to use our methodology to try and cross-reference that with the information you would get in a death certificate to come up with a kind of formula to be able to run analyses at a massive scale, looking at death records. So their figures estimated just under 600 people had died the previous year to the one we were looking at. And then they were also able, because they had this access to death records, to look back in time, and they showed that there had been this shocking increase, 24% increase over 5 years, and that the causes of death, just like our records showed, included kind of drugs, poisoning, liver disease, and then suicide as a high factor. And just like our data showed, shockingly low levels, life expectancy levels, particularly compared to the kind of general population, 42 years old for men, 44 years old for women. So we were incredibly grateful that the Office for National Statistics started recording that data. The National Records Office in Scotland then began to do the same. But we were really aware that, as I said right at the start, this wasn't just a project about data. It was about humans, human lives, people with dignity, people with their own stories. So we wanted to pass on the project, which we have done, to an organisation called the Museum of Homelessness, who are now collating and telling the stories of individuals. So if anybody wants to get in touch with them, Google Museum of Homelessness, you can log any deaths that you know about with them and support their work. That would be fantastic. Next slide, please. And then I'm aware we should get to questions. Just quickly, because I wanted to bring it up to date, obviously the ONS have continued to publish statistics and data, which is really helpful. They, but we still see that the data that is held officially is only part of the picture. So, you know, the government had said before, the official data before the pandemic hit showed that there were just over 4,000 people that were counted as sleeping rough in England and Wales, but actually 7 times that have been supported by the Everyone In programme. Now, people that, you know, that's not just rough sleepers, it's also people in temporary emergency accommodation, but it shows just how big an issue this is, which wasn't really reflected in that 4,300 figure. Also, UCL have done a really interesting study where they looked at all of the people brought in through Everyone In and compared it with COVID rates, and found that that amazing push to get people off the streets in 48 hours or so saved nearly 200 lives and many thousands more infections amongst that cohort. But sadly, the Museum of Homelessness have produced their most recent figures, and they saw actually last year there had been an increase in deaths, a huge increase actually, 37% increase on the year before. Not because of COVID, it doesn't look like that was the major factor, but for all the issues that we'd seen previously, drug and alcohol use and suicide factoring quite heavily. So while Everyone In was a huge success in many ways, the kind of long-term success of that is yet to be seen, and people were still dying while homeless. I think that might be the last slide, or penultimate. Finally, then, I wrote all of that into a book, No Fixed Abode, which goes in much deeper detail into the stories of people and their loved ones, and people who have experienced homelessness and come out of it, or are experiencing homelessness at that moment and looking for a way out, and tries to kind of, like I say, look at where the gaps are in the system that are failing people and look for the solutions that could prevent more deaths and prevent more homelessness in the future. So that was a whistle stop tour, quite a heavy.
That's fantastic, and I think your book sales may go up again after today.
I mean, not that that's what I'm in it for, but it is. Yeah, it's in paperback in a couple of months' time. So
fabulous. That was really useful to hear, and really interesting, because I hadn't appreciated, because obviously I've seen the ONS experimental data and figures, and I hadn't realized that your stuff had kind of predated that. So it's really useful to hear that and hear the stories behind it as well, and the kind of work and effort that's gone into it. And I think hearing you speak is kind of music to our ears, because we're kind of grappling with the lack of data and the complexities around trying to get some of this intelligence. And I know our colleagues on the call are grappling with that on a daily basis. So thank you ever so much for sharing that. Are there any comments or questions or anything people would like to say or come in on? Very, very powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, Emma.
Yes, go on. Is that Prince?
Yes, it is. Can I just come in? Yeah, that was just wonderful. And I don't think there was. I mean, I guess from the point of view, I think the only shocking thing from that presentation for me was the fact that nobody was recording the information. That's the shocking bit for me. In terms of everything else, I think it's. I mean, it's everything we know that is happening that we know should not have been happening. But I mean, the fact that we and that is that I guess we could almost call them the forgotten population in our society, because the thing is that if nobody records this data, then as far as they're concerned, you might as well not exist. You know, so I mean, the fact that even the coroner does not record the death is even more shocking.
Yeah,
and so from my point of view, I'm saying to myself, well, the first thing we need to do is almost get these there's key organizations that need to record this information, and that needs to be a start. Because so unless they record it, we don't know the extent of the problem, and we don't even know what we need to put in place to address it. Without data, it's very, very difficult to convince anybody that of the size of the issue.
I think that's really true. I think that the cynical view is that, you know, it's not helpful for lots of those big authorities to know this data. It's easier not to know it. I guess the more generous view is that it tends to fall between responsibilities often. There's housing and there's adult social care and there's health and somewhere, like, you know, as I found, everyone assumes someone else is collecting it. But what I found from going around the country was it was the GPs working with homeless populations. It was people who were doing kind of street kitchen feeds, you know, soup kitchen feeds, and hostels, who were keeping either this mental tally or just, you know, a physical piece of paper. And when I kind of came to them and said, do you have any idea? They were so relieved that somebody else was counting this as well. So yeah, I think it's a real lesson to learn from it is that don't be put off because data isn't being held. Think, if it isn't, somebody should be, and here's how we can do it, you know.
Agreed.
Rebecca, did you want to come in? And Nick, sorry. Nick was first.
Just I think the Rough Sleepers initiative that nationally is trying to ensure that some of this data is now captured. Many of us have multidisciplinary teams. I know the one in East Sussex has a multidisciplinary team, so we're trying to capture all the data on mental health needs, substance misuse, health needs, nursing needs, all of it. So that's encouraging to me. And also the SAR that was mentioned earlier by this safeguarding board, they're looking at this across East Sussex County Council as well, and trying to write a paper on the needs and how these cases need to be dealt with and managed across all services. Fantastic. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel, I'm hoping.
And we've got an example of some case reviews in a minute from Oxfordshire, so we'll touch on that in a second. Nick, did you want to come in? Sorry, I saw your hand and then didn't see it, and now. So apologies.
No, it's okay. My fault. I accidentally put it up actually, but I have realised there was something I'd like to ask. This is amazing. I remember at the time being totally impressed and thinking, finally somebody's getting a handle on this, and exactly as Chris was saying, appalled that it had to be you guys. You know, great that it was you guys, but also that it had to be that we just weren't gathering the data. One way of influencing, I completely understand, is via a book. Another way of influencing might be through the research kind of peer review journal articles, and I suspect that there's a way of configuring that data which would make sense in terms of kind of formal qualitative analysis, and I just wondered whether any of that had been done.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and I think we were slightly so we started off with the hashtag Make Them Count, which was the kind of framing of the project, which was we shouldn't be counting, someone else should. Yeah. And I think when the ONS did produce those figures, we maybe felt like that had been achieved enough, that actually it was the human side of things that, you know, that's why I went for the kind of book way, was to I guess try and touch hearts and minds. Well, sorry, I'm babbling a little, but I guess what I took away from the stories from what doing the research was, the figures are one thing. Actually hearing about Jane and Hamid and Nikolai stayed with me in a much deeper, more powerful, more potent way. And I thought, to the general public and maybe to politicians, that would be the way that kind of sparks change. That said, there has been some amazing more kind of scientific research that some UCL folks were doing. They got access to a data set, an NHS data set of people experiencing homelessness, and could look at kind of medical causes around deaths. And I think that, you know, that was journal reviewed paper, peer reviewed stuff. But you know, it's a really interesting thought, and something I will take away, is to assess something that could be codified further or explored further through academic writing.
So the bit that I got really excited about in terms of data was you've not just got outcomes, you've got mechanisms. So I was wondering whether, yes, okay, there are medical mechanisms, but you've got a slightly higher level, it sounds like you've got a slightly higher level of mechanism data. In other words, you know, what was the story? And there could be themes across those stories which could be really important on the way, and I'm sure it is. In fact, I have to get your book to understand this in a little more detail, about the ways in which what there's a medical cause, but there's also a physical and a behavioural and a social response cause. And I wonder whether your data would yield some really interesting themes on those.
Yeah, because you were talking about trauma and, you know, childhood experiences and some of that, and it'd be really interesting to unpick some of that.
Yeah, and it gets a bit more anecdotal, but there certainly was stuff about, you know, the way the system services are set up sometimes, where you can't access mental health treatment unless you get your addiction issues dealt with, but you can't get your addiction issues until you can prove that you in treatment for your mental health. All of these kind of catch-22s and the stuff about childhood adverse experience, there were definitely themes that started to present themselves through all of the interviews I did. The data doesn't necessarily speak to that in the same way, but the depth of the research, I guess, does. But yeah, it's interesting. Thank you.
Something for us to think about, Nick. Lynn, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Actually, very interesting book and a very interesting conversation, Emma. Just actually, one thing I think is we probably already collected some of the data through the wider determinants or through the district council. But I think the challenge is, how could we link those data, because it's non-health data, isn't it, to the health data, which is like GP data and also the secondary care, in order to see the full picture. And as just basically someone just mentioned, just mentioned the oh gosh, sorry, just my computer is a bit mad. Just mentioned so one thing I think is a data linkage in order to see basically that from the health angle and homelessness. Also mentioned about this multi-needs like substance misuse, mental health, and basically with a voluntary organization as well. So how this one could be done, I think that will be, I think in Kent, we are starting looking into these issues and how we can link those data really from because it have to be personal, like individual level data, isn't it? But I think we need some like a national initiative, like Public Health England, probably really looking into this through the population health management with the NHS England, because sometimes we do feel some challenges with NHS digital actually there. And also for this local level data, I think sometimes we probably need some help with the establishment about integrated care systems, about some devolution, about data linkage as well. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Oh, and also just say a quick example, actually, I think recently is under the COVID umbrella, Suffolk ICS, they did linked all this data together, actually. Yeah.
I mean, there are models as well to draw on. You know, the chain database in London doesn't do all of that, but it does allow different services to kind of log interactions with people. And I think, forgive me, I don't know the outcome of this, but I think Scotland was looking at whether they could implement something similar by which, you know, the person, no matter which area you travel to, local authority you interact with, there's a kind of record of the services you've participated in, as a way of kind of joining up people's care, so you're not working at cross purposes, or people aren't falling through gaps of knowledge and things. But yeah, maybe NHS England are the body to lead on that.
And actually, just mention in response to Maeve's answer, actually, it's been identified actually by Lankali Chase in the Hard Age. That report actually said for the 5 common characteristics, which including rough sleeping, homelessness, and then substance misuse, mental health, and also offending behavior. The reason the death is so high there is because there's no integrated data set there. Yeah, so I can share that report later. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Debbie.
So just to sort of partly answer that, there is some work. So mental health services usually do code people as being no fixed abode, but they don't always share that data. GPs rarely do, and there's been some work nationally on some codes, SNOMED codes, so that GPs and acute hospitals can better identify where people are homeless or at risk of being made homeless. And one of the things I really liked about your book, Maeve, is we're having a discussion about how we can use winter planning funding to prevent people from losing their accommodation. And there were quite a few examples in your book about, you know, different things that triggered the loss of accommodation. So not being able to cope with bills and the rent, you know, being a bit abusive to neighbours, hoarding, you know, and those themes I thought were really useful to sort of get services to try and think how they can keep people, how they can help people to maintain their accommodation, so that even if they're admitted to hospital, there's somewhere to go on discharge.
I think that was the single most frustrating thing I got out of the research. Was there are really clear markers for when somebody is about to fall into homelessness, and we know them, and there has been research on this time and time again, of things like people leaving care, people leaving prison, you know, being admitted to hospital and then being discharged again as no fixed abode. There was even research that showed a huge spike in health issues, and visits to the GP can often precede a drop into homelessness. And so that, you know, there's almost an algorithm out there that could be written that says you are at risk, this one's coming. But because we're not looking at the data in that way, or because people don't see the whole range of what's going on in someone's life, then people are falling into those into homelessness. But yeah, it's great to know that some people are looking out and those codes are being developed.
Brilliant. Right, we'll take Prince, and then we need to move on because time is running. Prince.
Yeah. Okay. Just one last thing is I was also fascinated by the story of the lady who was from a lovely family, had a lots of support network, etc. And it just makes me think, I'm just thinking about the other vulnerable groups in society that we somehow feel that we can fix them, like the gypsy travelers and et cetera. So I just wondered, you know, is it possible that some people, despite having the support structure, as in the case that you illustrated, that they actually, homeless becomes almost the way of life for them? You know, and what we should be doing is, rather than try to force them not to be homeless, is that the ones that do choose that way of life, like, just like travelers choose that way of life, then what we should be doing is making sure that we are, as a society, we recognize that we are all different and we have a different way of living. But actually, when we need something as a society, if we need access to healthcare, access to social care, whatever, we should have it.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think that 99% of the time, it's not a fully conscious choice, cultural lifestyle choice. I think it's actually, there's something deeper going on. In Jane's case, she had a lot of grief from a lost pregnancy, or the death of a child. She had drug and alcohol issues. She had been a victim of domestic abuse for many years. So I maybe made it seem too rosy a picture that she had a nice mum looking out for her. She also had all of this emotional trauma and baggage that she was carrying. And a guy from Alex from Pathways, the charity, said it best to me, was that nobody should be considered entrenched and beyond help. It's that you have to ask, you have to offer the help time and time and time and time and time again, in different ways, in different manners. And you just have to keep doing it until you get the right, either it's the right moment for them to accept it, or you find the right help for them. And it's almost too easy to say some people just choose this life and want to live like that. I think that is a way to shrug off some responsibilities. And I do think it's different to kind of cultural choices around kind of traveller communities. But yeah, it's complicated, and some people do at first glance seem to be choosing that lifestyle. But I guess I would question what kind of choice that is if you're left with a set of options that don't really fit you.
Absolutely. Really, really well made point. Thank you very much. And thanks ever so much for joining us today, Maeve. That was fabulous, and definitely people are already ordering books, so your sales are definitely going up today. Should we move on, Sarah? I know Debbie wants to cover a couple of the safeguarding review slides from Oxfordshire, which we thought would be useful, and there may be a bit of work we want to do following this, Debbie.
Yeah, so I just wanted to flag up that in our patch, we had a safeguarding adults review during that period with deaths of 9 homeless people. So this was one of your what you called a thematic review, Maeve, and that's the link to it there. And they came up with 15 recommendations, which I've reproduced on the following slide. And I suppose the message would be, I'm not going to go through them, but you don't need to wait for a death to happen to just check that all of this is in place. So you've got it in your pack. So I just encourage you to read through it. And Maeve in her book has got a checklist, which I really liked, which is, what we can do as an individual to about homelessness as an issue. And I really like that. And it sort of speaks to me as an individual, what I can do as an individual, as well as what I can do as a professional. The other thing I just wanted to mention briefly is when Lord Bird was on our call, the founder of The Big Issue, a couple of weeks ago, he said he'd only met in the whole of his career, and he must be late 70s now. He'd only met one person who actively chose homelessness, that resisted every attempt. One person in the whole of his career is I would even doubt that, actually. I even doubt that person really chose it as a lifestyle. Okay, that was me. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. I was kind of reflecting before we had today's session, and certainly from hearing Maeve and others today, I think it might be useful for us to do a bit of a follow-up, and maybe if people have done either thematic reviews or any actual safeguarding reviews of deaths, it might be useful for us to have a bit of a theme discussion and follow up on this, and also think about that bit around influencing, around lobbying to in terms of the statutory wording around SARS going forward, because it's certainly, we've got Elaine Goodwin, who's safeguard chief nurse around in terms of NHS England, who's taking a lead role around safeguarding, particularly for inclusion health. And I think we may have an opportunity to kind of push from that angle as well as kind of locally and across the southeast. So I think if people are interested in doing that, I think it might be something for us to follow up in a later session to have a bit of